and we want to in particular look at two papers that CERRE has recently published, one on the climate related resilience and one on the security of supply framework and risk preparedness regulation for an increasingly electrified system. We will start with this latter paper, which was co-authored by Chloé Lecoq from Paris Panthéon-Assas and Catherine Banet from Oslo University. And I would, before I pass on the word to Catherine to present her paper, I would like to just share a few housekeeping rules. So the online participants who I welcome will be able to share their questions in the Q&A chat. So keep them short, please. Share your name so that we can monitor those during the discussion and pick up on those. And I also wanted to say we will start with the security of supply paper and then move on to the climate resilience discussion. And with that, I hand over the word to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Annika. And first, I would like to thank my co-author, Professor Chloé Lecoq, for the excellent collaboration. Can't you hear me? Yes, good. Thank you. Then I would like as well to thank all the sponsors for their very useful inputs and trust. And finally, to the CERRE team for their support. Europe's energy landscape is indeed undergoing a profound transformation marked by decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. Rising electrification and renewable integration are increasingly stressing complexity of the grid and exposing new vulnerabilities, from physical congestion to cyber threats. While short-term electricity supply security remains stable, according to ACERRE, structural adequacy and system risk are projected to rise in the medium term. And against the backdrop of the 2021-23 energy crisis, the EU faces a dual challenge of strengthening its regulatory and emergency response tools while reconciling national security of supply and therefore priorities that could be balanced. And this reconciliation between national security of supplies and deeper EU-level coordination of integration is at the core of the paper we're presenting to you today. We move to the next slide, please. On objectives. Thank you. So against this background, our paper aims to clarify first terminology and get a precise understanding of the concepts of energy security and security of supply. It reviews and analyzes the currently applicable framework from treaty provision to secondary legislation and network codes and guidelines. And finally, it aims to contribute to the revision process that is ongoing at the EU level of the energy security framework, focusing on security of supply in electricity and the interactions with other energy carriers, reflecting on the legislative architecture, the implementable toolbox of measures, and providing policy recommendations. Next, please. The question raised in the paper is therefore as follows: how should the EU legislative and regulatory architecture be adjusted to strengthen security of supply within electricity and ensure thereof sufficient adequate supply resources in the power system to meet demand at all times? When it comes to the definition, the paper recalls the difference between energy security and security of supply, where energy security is defined by the International Energy Agency as the uninterrupted availability of energy at an affordable price. Security of supply is the ability of the energy system to supply end users with electricity of a certain quality on a continuous basis. Energy security is consequently a broader concept than security of supply, which it encompasses. Security of supply is defined as an objective of EU policy by the treaties, Article 194, and EU action to reach that objective must be conceived in a spirit of solidarity between the member states. The paper identifies three distinct layers within security of supply legislation. While focusing primarily in the paper on electricity, this framework equally applies to other energy carriers. The first layer comprises structural components of security of supply embedded in the electricity market design, which takes an electricity market-only approach as a starting point. The second layer encompasses supplementary mechanisms that address the remaining adequacy concerns, and particularly through capacity and flexibility mechanisms. And after the adoption of the electricity market reform last year, a question was whether the line between the first and second layer was blurring, with capacity mechanisms becoming a part of market design. The third layer defines the risk preparedness and emergency regime, which also contributes to maintaining or restoring security of supply, but in very specific circumstances of a crisis or emergency. And these three interconnected layers, illustrated here by the regulatory pyramid, form altogether the comprehensive architecture of EU security of supply. Next, please. When looking at the three layers, their articulation and interaction with the security of supply framework for the different energy carriers, we took into account some cross-cutting considerations to formulate our recommendations. And first, that was the degree of action based on the four options identified by the European Commission in its consultation documents, ranging from solely improvement of existing measures, alignment, streamlining, to new provisions, and the full adoption of new governance tools. Next, we deem as well important to ensure regulatory coherence in the choice of regulatory approaches, market-based, non-market-based, and the mechanisms in the toolbox, and so to ensure the right alignment and careful interlinkages, for example, between collateral effects between commodities, reporting requirements, or joint mechanisms. Next, we include both legal and economic considerations. And when it comes to legal considerations, they relate to repartition of competences, allocation of responsibilities between actors, the choice of legal tools, and so the procedure for adoption of revision, implementation, enforcement, and not least time constraints, because these threats are now pressing us to short-term action. When it comes to economic considerations, they are primarily related to cascading effects of interrelated risk and moral hazard issues, with the question of the design of solidarity mechanisms as a concrete example. Finally, we conclude that we need to do a bit of en même temps, strengthening local security of supply, and at the same time ensuring European solidarity for security of supply based on integrated energy market and strengthen integration of notably infrastructures. As we intend, and we move to the next slide, please, to provide concrete input to the ongoing revision process, the report ends with four main policy recommendations, which cover the following areas: market architecture, adequacy regulation, preparedness toolbox, and system-wide approach. And I'm now going to review shortly these four recommendations. First, next, please. Under policy recommendation number 1, we insist on the fact that the security of supply challenge should be framed as an integrated architecture made up of the three connected layers identified in the report. Security of electricity supply relies on measures in all three layers, and as well of this pyramid. They are both systemic and non-systemic risks addressed as well. And the recommendation is therefore to adopt targeted legislative amendments and market-based security of supply tools prioritizing power quality, inertia, local flexibility, stronger network operation, interconnection, and fit-for-purpose governance. And all that to raise resilience without undertaking a disruptive full electricity market reform where there is no appetite to reopening this discussion. And the forthcoming legislative and policy initiatives identified in the European Commission 2026 work program should enable a few targeted legislative adjustments to that respect. Next. The second area of recommendation relates to adequacy regulation. Scarcity may not always be handled by the energy-only market in extreme situations, but any supplementary mechanisms, in our view, must be carefully designed to support, not replace, market signals. And the EU adequacy frameworks and the rules for capacity and flexibility mechanisms should be adjusted with this non-distortion principle in mind. Our recommendation is therefore to use supplementary mechanisms only when they are non-distortive, transparent, and proportionate, to open them as far as possible to cross-border participation, should be technology neutral and performance-based, as well as time-limited, and so to address scarcity beyond the energy-only market. This should be done while avoiding distortions and free riding, and we also recommend that the criteria used to complete the European resource adequacy assessment and the EU-wide flexibility assessment platform should be further aligned. The third recommendation, next please, relates to the preparedness and emergency toolbox. The EU should definitely strengthen risk preparedness and by retaining the effective lessons from the previous crisis, winter energy crisis that led to some measures such as coordinated demand cuts, support for vulnerable consumers, and maybe we need to look again at this definition in both sectors, and fast cross-border data sharing, and all this with a clear legal basis, especially for temporary market interventions. The recommendation is there to adopt an EU-wide rules-based risk preparedness framework with harmonized assessment to regularly update the preparedness and emergency plans as it is already planned in the legislation, but to fine-tune the mechanisms, streamline notably crisis playbooks. And solidarity mechanisms could be improved, conditions on credible national preparedness to curb moral hazard. Finally, next slide, please. The fourth recommendation relates to the system approach to security of supply architecture. A system approach is necessary because electricity and gas depend on each other. Today, the rules for both sectors are written in separate silos, in two pieces of legislation at least, and to harmonize some concepts such as adequacy, scarcity, how scarcity prices work, who can provide demand response, will strengthen this framework that is interconnected and send the right signals to all types of investment in network, storage, or flexibility. All sources of security of supply should also be mobilized, such as biogases and in all sectors, including heating and cooling. However, adopting a common legislative framework on risk preparedness across energy carriers should not lead to bureaucracy and efficiencies. We identify in the report 4 main options for a future framework based on whether the frameworks remain separated or more aligned based on principles, institutional development, some common institutions, or merge into one single piece of legislation. In any case, what is important to retain is that there are differences in operations between electricity and gases, between the electrons and the molecules. Nevertheless, the parallelism of the institutional framework has been positive and should be kept with a parallel evolution of the electricity gas coordination group, the role of regional crisis centers, the role of regional coordination centers, RCC, and in the future, possibly an EU-level crisis alert system. So to conclude, we here recommend to build an integrated security of supply framework for electricity, gas, and low carbon gases with aligned rules, joint planning, shared data, so the system will be resilient, efficient, and market consistent. I thank you very much for your attention, and I give the word back to you, Annika.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. And I think there's a lot to disentangle here. But I found particularly interesting how you showed with your three-layered approach, the connection between regulatory tools on one hand, but also the role of the market in preventing and preparing and building more resilience into the system. Let's perhaps collect some reactions from our distinguished panelists. I welcome Monika Sigri from the European Commission today. You're here, you are heading the unit on energy security and safety, and certainly play a very important role in the upcoming revision of the security of supply framework. And I think you've been preparing quite a while for that. You've been running a fitness check and you've consulted a number of stakeholders. So I'd like to ask you perhaps to share some of your insights from that stakeholder consultation and also your reactions to the presentation of Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, we've been working on this for well over a year, and of course, building on the experience that we have gathered during the last 5 to 10 years, both actually on electricity, gas, but also in the other energy sectors. So indeed, we have analyzed the how the current regulations work and perform. And I think they went through a test or several test cases these last few years that helped us assess a bit better. So the main points or the main learnings that we had and the feedback that we have received also from the stakeholders, but also following a few analyses. First of all, is that the current framework is or was not really fully prepared for major disruptions where there is accumulation of several disruption elements. It was definitely not prepared for suddenly losing from one day to the other major energy supplies to the market. Of course, it wasn't just a volume question, it was also the duration of the crisis that counted, and also the number of countries that were impacted by that. And we have seen an impact, that the impact is cross-sectoral, so a major disruption on the gas market had quite serious impacts also on the electricity market. Or when we talk about blackouts that happened in different parts of Europe. In fact, those also affected other subsectors, gas, actually also oil supplies in certain countries. So this was one of the learnings that we have to reinforce in the current framework. The other one is the emerging new risks. We have heard in the introduction that we are in a geopolitical context which is quite uncertain. We do not know what can happen, but definitely the tensions are high. We also see increasing cyber and hybrid attacks on our infrastructure, as well as the climate impact can be felt on the energy system, be it on demand or the supply side, but also on our infrastructure. And I think this discussion will continue also following this one focused on electricity. This is also something that we have identified, is that the cross-sectoral integration of these frameworks is not strong enough. And I think the study that you were just presenting is highlighting the need to have a more integrated view and a more integrated action or approach to managing security of supply situations, being prepared on the one side, mitigating the potential impact, as well as then when it comes to crisis management. And there was also a reference to a cross-border cooperation. The question is whether we see it in a positive or a negative way. We cannot stop a crisis on the borders. The systems are very well integrated, and so we have to make sure that there is a cooperation and there is a harmonized approach to different risks across Europe, and also the action that is taken. It is much more based on cooperation. So just as a very first reaction.
Thank you very much, Monica. Very interesting points already. Let's maybe have a practical perspective. Maria Kakidou, you are the Director of Strategic Market Analysis at the utility PPC. How are you preparing for challenges? How are you experiencing the current situation? And do the findings of the authors resonate with you?
Thank you, Annika, and thank you, CERRE, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join this discussion on Europe's security of supply. PPC Group is the leading power tech company in Southeast Europe, active across the entire electricity value chain, from generation and networks to retail. As we have heard before in the beginning about the challenge that we face due to electrification and the rapid growth of renewables, just to say that, to comment that we consider this the only credible path to achieve Europe's goals of decarbonization, affordable energy and secure supply. So in that way, we reduce our dependence on imported fossil fuels. And at PPC, we actively support this transition. So we expand the solar and wind generation, we promote electrification in transport, heating, and we explore as well other technologies such as hydrogen. To make this transition work, we really should invest in flexibility. Flexibility is key. And as renewables expand, we need assets that can respond quickly and to balance the system and ensure reliability. That's why in PPC, we are investing in flexible assets, whether this is BESS, battery assets, or hydro, or flexible gas-fired plants. These are technologies that can provide the backup and the stability that the system, the evolving system, needs. At the same time, the dispatchable capacity remains essential. So in the south, where we operate in the Southeast Europe, we have the characteristic of a very old and inefficient generation fleet, especially in Bulgaria and Romania. They are retiring plants or are in a decarbonization path. And in order to avoid generation gaps, we need stronger regional cooperation, joint vulnerability or adequacy assessments, and well-designed regional capacity mechanisms to keep flexible and low-emission plants viable. And this becomes more and more important as climate-related threats, like heat waves or cold spells, are increased and become the new norm, putting pressure on both generation and grids. So what else we do to increase our resilience is we invest in a diversified portfolio in the area across Southeast Europe, but also a diversified RES portfolio in different technologies. So different weather patterns and interconnected operations help us balance production and demand more effectively across the region. As I said before, PPC also has in its activities the operation of grids, distribution grids, and strengthening the grid is another major priority. So through HEDNO, which is our subsidiary, we are modernizing and digitalizing the network with smart grids, technologies, and advanced metering, automation, so that we can be more ready for the future system. We are also reinforcing our systems to be ready for physical and cyber resilience. We are investing in digital tools for forecasting or data-driven grid operation, so that we will be ready for a stronger and more reliable future. Now, with regards to the results of the study, we believe that it has It resonates strongly with our experience, especially its focus on the regional coordination and cross-sector integration and the market-based mechanisms. And we fully agree that maintaining security in an increasingly electrified system requires a regional and forward-looking and flexible approach. The priorities that we see in the revision, the upcoming revision of the security of supply framework are, first, we need better governance, transparency, and accountability. We think that the information should flow during and after system disruptions. And we also need to ensure that the market participants are involved before and after implementing market measures or measures for the crisis. Secondly, we think that we need to be more on the proactive planning instead of reactive. So there is a need to change the planning of the framework for investing in grids or reinforcement of resilience. And we need to take into account the anticipatory investments and make a clear framework for the operators to be able to invest in resilience and climate adaptation. As a third pillar, we consider that it's crucial to increase the cross-border infrastructure and make sure that it's working efficiently. I think that are the main pillars that we are looking at.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, thank you. That was already very comprehensive, and I think it showed very well the challenge we're facing here, because Monica was talking about the crisis learnings and also the preparedness for new emerging challenges, whereas you show very well that you also have to operate in a changing system, in a system in transition that also needs to adapt, and there need to be investments in flexibility and grid upgrades. There needs to be better regional cooperation. Now, talking about regional cooperation, I'm looking at Jodie O'Boyle. You are the electricity lead at the utility regulator from Northern Ireland, and you are, of course, very dependent on a good cross-border cooperation. And I would like to ask you a little bit about your experiences with the current legislative framework, also with the implementation of recent legislative measures that were done here and there, also in response of the crisis, and perhaps also what you thought about the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. First of all, congratulations on the paper. It does highlight the importance of security supply. Here in Northern Ireland, we are quite unique in that we are part of a synchronised all-island network with the Republic of Ireland. We have different DNOs, different TSOs, different regulators, but we are working together to maintain a single electricity market. Now, the security supply here can be affected by many things: weather, storms, fuel supply resulting from world events, emissions from fossil fuel plants, cyber attacks. But typically, it's weather that would affect here, and typically weather wouldn't just affect one part of the island; it affects the island as a whole. If we have a storm, for example, in Northern Ireland, likely the Republic of Ireland is also affected. And over the last few years, we've had quite a number of major storms, which has meant customers have been off for several days and key infrastructure has been damaged. For example, during Storm Dara in December 2024, Ballylongford Power Station had structural damage to one of its chimney stack, and that caused a significant loss of generation capacity and meant that the power station had to operate at a reduced capacity. And during that kind of event, we had to activate our system defense plan, update the European awareness system, activate our emergency incident centers, and incident teams were on the ground to try and restore power. And a lot of work was done by many agencies to try and bring people back online again. But the electricity system here is changing both north and south and across Europe. We're getting increased data center connections. We're getting increased renewables. There's offshore development. There's an increase in interconnection. So there is an ambition here to change. And as we're moving towards a more integrated system, we're seeing planning, consents, legislation, and regulations as kind of main time barriers for those kind of large scale developments. So as regulators, I think guidance is key here. You can draft a network code or a regulation, but when it comes to implementing that code or regulation operationally, the interpretation of the requirements of that code or regulation is key. So I do think there needs to be targeted guidance on how this relevant code or whatever needs to be implemented across member states, so that the legislation and the regulators are common across all states. Now, an example of this would be key in the implementation of the new EU network code on cybersecurity. Now, no two member state systems are the same, and as we move to a more integrated system, the resilience of that system needs to be able to react to the changes. So I do think that cross-border coordination is very important, particularly in scenario planning and emergency response planning between member states. So I think that more cooperation is needed to ensure that the European network, can meet its security supply risks, and that the system is able to buffer those and maintain a system security supply. So that includes, common legal regulation considerations within each member state. I understand that we can have different state aids, we can have different renewable support systems, there can be different market interventions, and that can all result in a divergence between member states. But only with common arrangements across member states can a European system ensure that they have a stable security supply.
Thank you, Jody. Yeah, so calling for a more coordinated implementation across member states, we hear that a lot. There must be some ways of addressing this issue. I think it's a common issue for EU legislation. Turning to our EU neighbors, appreciated neighbors from the UK. So Liz Berger, you're the head of climate resilience, but I'd like to already ask you, what approach is the UK taking to resilience?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so in the UK, there's definite realisation that the threats to resilience are growing, and there's an urgent need for more joined up action on resilience. So what we've been doing is in Ofgem, so with the regulator, we've been very proactive in terms of strengthening our regulatory approaches on building resilience across different areas of resilience, so including cyber, climate and asset health. And we've been working very closely with both government and the newly created national, well, it's been for a year now, National Energy System Operator, to clearly clarify our respective roles and responsibilities, and we've been quite focused on that. Through this work, it's become quite clear that we need greater coordination between the different areas of resilience to make sure that we have the necessary frameworks, metrics and tools to unlock regulatory options, especially as these risks don't happen in isolation, they happen collectively. So we're putting greater focus now on bringing it all together. So I think this paper is really this paper and set of papers that are looking at resilience as a whole is really timely and helpful. And I think, yeah, just makes a point for having this more joined up approach. And I think that's not only true for a more joined up approach between the different areas of resilience, but also across the different countries as well and member states, so we can work out, although there's differences, there's also a lot of similarities, and we can improve our impact and the speed of action if we work together to understand these frameworks. One of the things we think in the UK, which is a main barrier to action, is actually clarity on what is an acceptable level of resilience. So as we know, these threats are growing. So if we want to maintain current levels of service or resilience, it's likely going to need increased investments, but that increased investment does come with a cost, and we want to protect consumers from costs. So we need to make to be clear on what level of resilience is enough. Now, obviously, the answer for this may well be different for different locations and requires flexibility of approach. Different areas may have different levels of risk appetite. So, but that being said, you can have the common frameworks and ways of thinking about it that enables you to make those decisions. And we think there are reasons why this is challenging currently, including how you measure and value resilience. I know the climate resilience paper goes into into some of this as well. So what we're trying to do in the UK is address some of these issues so that we can make progress on saying what is an acceptable level and then have the regulation that follows. And the final point I wanted to make is that I think starting these sets of papers with a look at the security of supply is a useful way of looking at it. Security of supply is one way to define resilience, and it's one of the key areas that threats such as climate and cyber will affect, and it's one of the ways we can define resilience. But we need to consider, and this was mentioned earlier, about the changing system and greater electrification and decarbonisation. We may need to slightly reconsider how we define security of supply. So we need to move from thinking about, do we have the downstream oil and gas required to ensure the supply, but we need to perhaps expand our thinking to think about the whole system and also networks to ensure that the infrastructure delivers the energy we need to consumers at the end of the day. And obviously some of these threats could affect that as well. So I think the paper is a really excellent start and includes like really useful suggestions on improvements. It does seem mostly focused on the market side, and that makes sense in a lot of cases, but I think there is also, and I think the point on greater interconnectivity is really important as well. But I do think there is some thinking that within the wider community as well, we need to consider in terms of like what I was saying, in terms of how we define and measure security of supply. So things like, one of the ways of looking at security of supply and measuring it and modelling it is loss of load expectation, but that perhaps doesn't pick up on some of the more extremes that we might be more interested in as a result of greater electrification and being more reliant on weather dependent renewables at the time that the variability of weather's decreased, the variability is increasing, but also looking at regulation beyond markets and how they might affect security of supply. So things like the system design considerations and things like how we strengthen our assets at the network levels and how all of this fits together. But overall, I think it's an excellent start and moves the discussion on in a really good way.
Thanks a lot, Liz. And I think you showed how difficult the role of a regulator, but also of an institution like the European Commission is right now to coordinate the different levels of crisis response, but also security of supply regulation, but then also to address the trade-offs. You mentioned the cost. What is an acceptable level of resilience, and what can we actually what cost can we give to the consumers and to the operators, and what is the acceptable level, and how can you measure resilience? Very interesting discussion we should pick up on in our bigger round. I would like to first introduce our second paper that we just published, which was co-authored by Niels Henrik von der Veer from Oslo University, who will join us a little bit later. He's teaching, and Fredrik Mar Baldursson from Reykjavik University, two economists. They have looked into climate resilience. And Fredrik, I already see you on the screen, so I would like to hand over the word to you.
Thank you, Annika, and good afternoon, everyone. So I have the next 10 minutes to walk you through some key points from our report. I'll highlight the context, main themes, and a few questions to think about going forward. The report is co-authored with Professor Niels Henrik von der Veer, as Annika mentioned, and it also reflects excellent feedback of the sponsors, for which we are thankful. I will not attempt an exhaustive presentation of the report. Instead, I hope to whet your appetite to read the entire report. To set the stage, let me start with the question of why climate resilience has become such a pressing issue for Europe's energy systems. As highlighted in the report, and of course, we have talked about this already today, or other speakers, recent extreme weather events, whether it's heat waves and wildfires or flooding, have confirmed that energy infrastructure is increasingly exposed to climate hazards. And they are no longer rare anomalies. They are becoming part of the operational reality, you might say, for transmission and distribution system operators across Europe. And of course, generators can be included in this as well as consumers, but what in the report we focus on TSOs and DSOs. At the same time as this is happening, Europe's energy grids are undergoing fundamental transformation driven by decarbonization, electrification, and digitalization. And this makes these systems more complex and in some ways more vulnerable. Physical reinforcement, we tend to think about that when we talk about resilience. Stronger substations, flood defenses, or increased redundancy in the system is, of course, a part of resilience, but it's not the whole story, and it's not enough on its own. Improving resilience also means anticipating potential shocks, maintaining flexibility to absorb them, restoring service quickly when disruptions occur, and adapting over time as risks evolve. In other words, it's as much about systems, operations, and learning as it is about concrete and steel. Historically, energy regulation has focused on three pillars: efficiency, security of supply, and decarbonization. And I think you might say that resilience is emerging as the fourth pillar, but it's still immature. It's still being defined and implemented in regulatory practice. And that's the gap our report tries to address: how to embed resilience more systematically within existing frameworks. We can go to the next slide. So let me discuss some of the main themes of the report. First, climate risks. That's, of course, the main motivation for a report, and I've already talked about this, that extreme weather is becoming more frequent and severe. Each type of hazard, and we try to give an overview of the various hazards in the report. Each type of hazard affects electricity and gas infrastructure differently in some ways. Importantly, these risks are now systemic. They affect multiple sectors and often multiple countries simultaneously. A second theme is identifying regulatory gaps. While EU legislation, for example, the 10E regulation and the CERRE directive, acknowledges climate risks, the actual implementation of resilience in regulation is still patchy. I think that's fair to say. There's no consistent requirement across member states for TSOs and DSOs to conduct or publish climate risk assessment, and project evaluation methods, such as CBA for major projects, still don't properly value high-impact, low-probability events. In other words, the regulatory focus remains on the three traditional pillars I mentioned earlier, rather than long-term resilience. And as a result, climate adaptation is often reactive, responding to damage after the fact, rather than being integrated into planning and investment decisions. A third theme of the report is an outline of options for embedding resilience in regulation. The report gives a blueprint for several pathways for addressing regulatory gaps. I'll just name a few. There are additional options outlined in the report. One pathway is to update project evaluation guidelines, such as for CPA analysis or ex post efficiency reviews of operations, where that is applicable, so that resilience and adaptation benefits can be quantified and compared alongside economic and decarbonization metrics. Another option is to build resilience incentives directly into tariff frameworks, for example, by linking part of allowed revenues to service continuity or recovery times after severe weather. And a third pathway I'd like to mention is to make climate resilience planning a formal regulatory requirement similar to reliability or quality of supply obligations. Of course, each approach has its own advantages and trade-offs. Reform of project evaluation methods offers analytical consistency and clarity, I guess you might say, but depends on improved data and methodology. Tariff-based incentives create strong financial motivation, but may require careful calibration to avoid over or undershooting. And mandatory resilience planning ensures accountability, but can become a compliance exercise, ticking the boxes, if not tied to meaningful performance outcomes. Coordination across borders, that's already been talked about today. That's an important theme in our report as well. Climate events, of course, don't respect national boundaries. Think of the heat wave this summer. So resilience cannot be addressed solely at the national level. Better regional coordination in scenario analysis and stress testing, possibly through ENTSO-E or CERRE, would make it easier to prevent cascading effects and share recovery capacity. And the final theme I'd like to mention is the balance between EU-level consistency and national flexibility. Some resilience measures, like defining common metrics or establishing minimum standards, make sense at the EU level, but implementation needs to reflect national conditions, different climate risks, infrastructure maturity, and regulatory capacity. So we need a layered approach, EU consistency on principles with flexibility in how member states put them into practice. Next slide, please. And the final one, I might say. So I'll close with a few questions that reflect some of the conceptual tensions we found in the report. We don't make firm policy recommendations. We outline options or pathways for thinking about going forward, and some of these questions reflect some of those issues. So first, how can climate resilience be embedded in regulatory practice without overburdening operators or consumers? Of course, new regulation implies new obligations. So this is really a balancing act. Regulators need to ensure networks are resilient, but they also have to maintain affordability and predictability for consumers. So should resilience measures be treated as part of the normal cost of doing business going forward, or as exceptional measures that require separate treatment or incentives? Second, should resilience be treated as a core criterion in project appraisal and tariff setting? In many countries, project evaluation analysis and tariff frameworks focus on efficiency and reliability. I think it's fair to say that this is dominant now, not long-term climate risk. So would integrating resilience as a core criterion help redirect investment and operations toward improved climate resilience, or could it risk overly complicating existing approval processes? The third question I'd like to raise is, what role should EU-level institutions play in coordinating resilience planning? We already have mechanisms like the 10E framework and the CERRE directive, and of course institutions like ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G and CERRE. But climate risks are cross-border and systemic, so perhaps there is a need for stronger coordination at the EU level, maybe through joint stress testing or regional scenario exercises. This is one question. Of course, you might argue that these should remain primary national responsibilities. This needs to be discussed. Fourth, how can we ensure regulatory consistency while respecting national diversity in climate risks and energy systems? A northern DSO facing snow and freezing conditions, icing of power lines, collapse of masts is not in the same situation as a DSO in the Mediterranean exposed to heat and wildfires. So how do we balance those diverse risks? The EU, how do we balance EU-wide principles, transparency, comparability, common metrics, with flexibility for local circumstances? Fifth question, and the final question on the slide, what mechanisms, and of course that's a key question going forward, what mechanisms offer the most efficient path toward resilient energy infrastructure? Different approaches suit different contexts. Incentive-based regulation might work well for electricity, while insurance or pooled risk-sharing schemes, for example, might fit better for gas networks or smaller DSOs. Just by way of examples, without any implications, that is necessarily true. Our analysis suggests that there is no single solution. A combination of approaches may be needed, ranging from reforms to EU-level legislation and project assessment guidelines to national incentive schemes and insurance frameworks. The challenge is to balance consistency across Europe and flexibility for regulators to respond to diverse local risks. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that with the thought that investment in resilience can be seen as a form of insurance. Costs incurred today to reduce the likelihood of greater losses tomorrow. I think that's how one should think about it. How these costs are recognized in regulation, how responsibilities are divided between EU and national levels, and how risks are shared between operators, consumers, and insurers are important questions. And the answer to those questions will shape Europe's ability to safeguard its energy systems under a changing climate.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the attention.
Thanks a lot. That was very clear, and I think a great example of, I mean, I take away from this presentation that climate events are really like fish in your hands because they're very different in nature. It's very difficult to estimate their effects. They may have cascading effects also into other sectors, talk telecoms, or anyway, it's really difficult to handle for regulators. Let's collect some reactions from our distinguished panel here, some practitioners. But before I do that, I would like to turn to the International Energy Agency because Christine Brandstedt is today with us. Now, sorry, you are the team lead for transition tracking and analysis, but you also work on resilience, and you've recently run some global discussions on resilience. Tell us a little bit about your impressions from there. Is it me or I can't hear you?
Yes, now it should be better. So thank you very much for having this important discussion and also for having us as part of it. For us, this is a very timely stream of work that you started here because, as you say, we're also looking into climate resilience increasingly at the agency. And indeed, we recently hosted a high-level roundtable on the effects of extreme weather on energy infrastructure. Some of the participants in this webinar have been there as well, but in general, we've been quite positively surprised or reassured by the level of interest in this. We had about 90 delegations from more than 30 countries participating, each coming to this table with a bit of a different perspective, looking at participants from government, from industry, finance, and civil society, looking at both the extreme weather perspective, but also clearly seeing the synergy with what would be the first topic of your webinar today, where we look more at security of supply, risks, and potentially even attacks to the energy system, because a lot of the measures that we discuss and a lot of the preparedness we discuss for both those events eventually might be similar, or there might be synergies between them. So at the roundtable, we look at this issue from a global perspective, so beyond just Europe. And clearly, it is an issue that's not just a European one, but also worldwide. And we look at all aspects of the energy sector in principle, but we clearly see that the electricity sector seems to be in focus for this discussion, just because it is a particularly fragile, if you want to call it that, element of energy supply. And then measures that have been discussed in the debates for us are very much linked to what you also look at in your papers, where first we have a planning stage where we can just ensure that resilience has been thought along from the beginning in the sense of de-risking sources and locations. We are discussing preparedness measures, hardening of infrastructure, such as, for example, flood barriers or remote sensing and things like that, and then also greater efforts for response and recovery measures. For the IEA, this is what we call a expanding body of work, so it's not exactly clear what it is that we can best contribute to this debate and to this topic, but we have started, for example, to track extreme weather events that have an impact on the energy sector. The World Energy Outlook is set to come out next week. So in that, for example, you'll find some first analysis of that. And we're also particularly seeing that, for example, extreme heat events across the world, and conversely, probably also extreme cold, extreme temperature events, you could say, have a specific impact on the energy sector, where there are sort of extreme events which are out of the ordinary ranges of what we're prepared for. And we have started some first analysis, which you can also see there, about the magnitude of the impact of these things. And moving forward, we're also looking at the impacts of other types of weather events, and what kind of measures we would be looking at in order to support stakeholders and actors in this debate to sort of be able to plan their actions and trajectories on this issue, but also to potentially just provide more information and maybe even just distribute more information on what is at stake regarding resilience and how to address the issue. Maybe as one, I don't know if I get to come back later on, but as one reaction specifically also to your study, not just advertising your own work here. One thing that I personally find interesting is how you look at affordability as a component of that, in the sense that if we translate resiliency efforts into regulation, this will to some extent potentially affect affordability, in the sense that maybe things become more expensive because of resiliency measures. But what we have recently seen, for example, if you look to the US, where a study has recently been published, is that also the lack of resilience seems to increasingly have an impact on affordability, where some of the rate increases in the US have been very clearly linked back to recent extreme weather events and the damages to infrastructure. So on the one hand, you have an affordability component of increasing resilience, but clearly it seems that we also have an affordability component by the lack of resiliency. So that can be an interesting component to also consider in this type of work. And with that, I don't want to overstep my time and get back to you, Annika, and subsequently to some of the other speakers.
Thanks a lot, Christine. And I think there's indeed a lot to be learned also from other regions in the world that are already frequently dealing with climate events and have found their own ways. I think we will hear that also from practitioners. Turning first to the gas sector, Arantxa Bodden, you head European and International Affairs at the gas operator GRDF in France. How are you affected by climate events?
So thank you very much for the invitation and congratulations for this initiative. And indeed, GRDF, as a gas distribution company, we have a strong industrial culture of safety and crisis management with contingency plans and extreme events in close coordination with local authorities. So since 2019, we launched our resilience project, and we report on 7 climate hazards every year. And last year, we received for the first time this demand from the government to submit a climate change adaptation plan. So we have therefore studied the +3 degree scenarios assess the risk and combining exposure and vulnerability of our assets. And we have therefore quantified the investments needed and designed the action plan. What I can say in terms of results is there are things to do, but they are identified, and the level of investments needed is really low compared to our security ones. As the study mentions, this impact can be less, also thanks to the precautionary investments that have been made during the last years. But in general terms, since gas distribution networks are underground, they offer a natural protection against wind, floods, and heat waves. Also, the use of polyethylene materials ensures flexibility, durability, and industrial safety. So gas networks offer higher resilience than other networks, meaning that they are a valuable asset for a resilient system. And concerning your question about, there are some points in the study that really indeed resonate for us. First of all is that this broader exposure to climate risk requires coordination between networks operators at local level, and from our experience, not only between gas and electricity, but also with heat, water, and communication networks. Secondly, is that the European level coordination that the paper mentions regarding ENTSO-G and ENTSO-E, as well as the TYNDP, historically focus on cross-border issues. And from our DSO perspective, we suffer a lack of knowledge about the distribution value and constraints like the capillarity and the link to territories and customers, the new local renewable gas production and circularity. Therefore, we are willing to see the gas joining the EU DSO entity next year and look forward to be part of the discussion at European rules to contribute with our specificities. And the third element is that the note invites to look at the consequences of the loss of service in case of critical events and talks about insurance. But from our point of view, the best would be to limit the losses for the end users. And there are simple and affordable ways to reduce them. So hybrid solutions after the meter, like batteries and solar panels, that are very useful for summers, but also in winter could allow to run the boiler in case of some days of electricity lack. The complementarity of gas and electricity, especially on the customer side, is a key to resilience. This hybridization of combining heating methods like gas and electricity, or wood and electricity in rural areas, together with the battery and renewable electricity, allows the best of both worlds for homes or for industries if they use the cogeneration. So when there is a storm, if you don't have both systems, it is harder. As a conclusion, I would say that coupling electricity and gas via flexible electrification of heat enables to get the best of both worlds, the benefit of affordable renewable electricity when available, and the affordability and resilience of the gas infrastructure and locally produced renewable gases.
Thank you, Arantxa. And I think you brought up how important it is to have a whole sector perspective. And that's been called on a lot of times at CERRE, but also in Brussels increasingly, and to stop working in silos. I think that was in Catherine's and Chloe's report. So it is really important also for the affordability of any measures that we're discussing here. Now I'm turning, and I'd like to say I see that there are questions in the chat, also on the consideration of other technologies. We will come to that. I will call back again on Monica right after the speakers, but I'd like to hear first from Oliver Franz, who's the Vice President for European Regulation at E.ON, to hear a little bit about the climate-related challenges that you're facing as energy utility, but also as DSO, distribution grid operator.
Thank you, Annika. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
because we had some technical difficulties. And if you see a still picture now, as I do on my screen, that is because the system still believes I'm trying to use my computer. Very sorry for that. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you also to Frederick and Niels for doing the study, and also for taking care of the discussions, especially with me and our perspective. So I'd like to come back to what Frederick has been saying, agreeing very much with him. So yes, for instance, I do believe, as he does, that there is probably a necessity to build this fourth leg for regulation, because as we know from other topics, if there is no clear mandate, regulators have a very hard time evolving into certain directions. You can see the same, by the way, and maybe that's another thing that we ought to be doing with regards to the question, are they really also responsible for making the transition happen, or are they just thinking about the NECPs when taking their tariff decision, which is more or less in paraphrasing what is written in European law right now. And of course, the reform of the governance regulation is the obvious and possible way to do that. With regards to the measures and how to incorporate them into regulation, and that's a bit the first question that Frederick has been asking. From my experience, regulators usually have a good way forward if some other public institution has already taken a decision. So if you allow me to draw the parallel, we had a time when in Germany, and it's still the case, if you were engaged in a publicly funded project, that project cost should be treated differently in regulation. And then if you want the stamp given by another public institution, namely to fund the project, in the end was what was needed in order to also go on with the regulatory process. So if I may draw the parallel, what would help probably is if some other security institution, for instance, would say, okay, we have changed now our flood prognoses, and therefore we know that in this valley, certain substations must be changed. Then that will have an easy way forward. If that is not the case, then probably the CBA, as suggested in the study, is another way of doing that. Or if you allow me the little joke, as you might be aware, most security fences, at least in Germany right now, are 2.5 meters high if they have barbed wire on top. And if somebody was to decide that they need to be 3 meters for whatever reason, then that also would mean that going forward, we would probably build higher fences, and the additional cost for that should then also be considered okay from the regulator's point of view. And maybe then one level deeper, and that's maybe also where I will stop. One of the discussions that we had when we compiled the study was a bit, when is the investment control happening in the regulatory process? So are we discussing the necessity and efficiency of the investment before we do it or afterwards? Afterwards is mostly in TOTEX systems, where we also introduce benchmarking processes. And then I believe the regulatory changes necessary are probably a bit more, not necessarily complicated, but they're just different in the sense that you would probably need to discuss, especially if you have different SOs, which are also having different amounts, let's say, of work to do in order to become more resilient, how you will treat these costs later in the benchmark, because what you probably don't want is that somebody is punished, if I may use that word, in the benchmark because they invested in some resilience measure, and you did not either have a cost variable in the benchmark to take care of that, or you probably will need to take the cost out. Very technical topic, I know, but sometimes the how should I say, the secret of making regulation happen is in the detail. So that's maybe our perspective. Otherwise, we very much believe that, having seen the R incident, for instance, in Germany, we will need to change the way we operate the grid in certain areas, and then the debate must be had, and this report is probably a very good first step in that way. Thank you.
Oliver, pity, I think most people couldn't see you, but you've opened a number of really interesting questions. Is a mentality change needed in regulation? Can regulators move faster when they get like an indication from another public institution? the ex post ex ante question for can you assess climate risks as ex ante? Or do you better go for compensation ex post? So we should pick that up again. Turning to Clara Poletti, who knows these questions all too well. You're heading ARERA still, and you've been also the chair of the ACER group of regulators, long-standing experience. Please, you are also, Italy is featured in the report. Can you tell us a little bit about how Italy is approaching the topic?
Yes, thank you, Annika. First of all, let me say that I really appreciated the report. I read it, and I think it's very rich, and I suggest you to read it, to everybody to read it, because it's very interesting. So Italy, ARERA has been working on quality of service for a long time. And then it was sort of more than 10 years ago when we realized that what we at that time called acts of God were increasing. So a number of events that were not under the control of the DSO that had a relevant impact on the quality of service. So we decided at that time that we needed to address the issue of what we call today resilience, climate resilience, more carefully, and that the existing tools were not enough. So I think this is something we really believe in. We need a specific regulation for resiliency. So we need to consider specifically resiliency in our regulation. But of course, resiliency should be embedded in our general framework, but that takes time. So it's a step-by-step approach, it's a learning process. We are not there yet, but this is what we want to do. So first step, let me say 3 steps I think we need to address when discussing how to regulate resiliency. First is how to assess the risks. This is something that you find in the report as well. In Italy, we have decided that we have defined a risk index. Our risk index depends on the time of return of an extreme event, let's say a windstorm or a wet snow, whatever. The time of return between 2 events, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And its impact, how many customers would be impacted by that event. Of course, that's something that should be assessed at local level. I mean, it's not an overall assessment. And here it's important to recognize that as energy regulators, we don't have this type of competencies usually. So we need to relate and to discuss and to coordinate with climate experts, with other experts that can help us modeling and estimating, or we can ask our operators to do that. So this is a new competence that we need to take into account. Second step is to decide how to integrate this assessment into the investment planning. What we have done is since 2018, we asked our major DSOs to prepare a resiliency plan, identifying both the climate risks according to the index and to our metrics and the targeted investments. The approach was later extended to the transmission operator, and here is where you have, when you have to assess the targeted investments, is where the cost comes into play. That was mentioned before. How much are we willing to spend? But first of all, at least you need to have an estimate of the needed investments. Third, you have to decide how to adapt your economic regulation to include all these elements, the inputs that you have. This is a complex topic. I don't think in 5 minutes I can say much about it, but I just wanted to tell you that we decided to set up a specific fund because, as has been said in the report as well, there is a sort of insurance issue related to resiliency as well. So we have this fund that is financed through a small surcharge by this paid by customers, and the fund is a way to share risks between customers and operators as well. And then we could discuss how that sharing should be done, but at least the fund is a tool. And this is why I wanted to mention it. We have a system of an incentive mechanism to support the investment process of DSOs and TSOs, and the investment mechanism is related to the performance. So if you do, the performance is measured in terms of avoided outages, avoided delays in restoration, and the fact that I'm using the word avoided a lot is a sign of how difficult that is, because we don't have a time series to build our incentives on. We have to work on what if, and so that's very tricky. And this is why I agree that we need, in the implementation, we still really need to learn and to study. And so we are not at the point where we can have a uniform European approach here. We have to learn from best practices.
Super, thank you so much. And it really showed your examples, how helpful it is to hear what our neighbors are doing. And staying though in Italy, Alessandro Lazzarini, you're the head of resilience planning and network security at the electricity grid operator in Italy. Could you share some of your impressions and also how the report resonates with you? And keeping in mind that we're running out of time, we want to go back to some of the speakers again.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss about an important topic like that of resilience. For sure, for Terna, ensuring the resilience of critical infrastructure is of absolute importance, since indeed Terna is the largest independent transmission system operator in Europe, with more than 75,000 kilometers of high and extra high voltage lines managed. Given that scale, the exposure of our asset to extreme weather phenomena cannot be underestimated. Considering also that our network is distributed all over the Italian territory and is mainly composed of overhead line. As the intensity and frequency of occurrence of extreme weather event is expected to further rise in the following years, grid operators are called upon to develop and adopt new, innovative and forward-looking approach to anticipate future trends that cannot longer be predicted by the sole analysis of historical data and historical trends. And for this reason, Terna is 2020 has developed a new perspective and probabilistic methodology to assess the level of resilience of the Italian transmission grid by identifying the areas of the grid that will be more exposed to high impact, low probability events in the future, and by quantifying the related risk. At the same time, the methodology enables Terna to evaluate the resilience interventions that help us to mitigate those risks and to quantify the benefits in terms of a reduction of expected energy not served to the final users, and as said before, also the increase in return period of the event. And being able to quantify both the ex-ante risks and the benefits of the intervention is fundamental to prioritize the intervention areas and to identify the most cost-effective and efficient interventions to mitigate that risk identified. In the process of developing and in adoption of the resilience methodology, it was fundamental the cooperation with other stakeholders, such, for example, the regulator and academic and research institution. In particular, the close interaction with ARERA was fundamental in the consolidation and validation process of the methodology, which after a period of public consultation was formally approved and included in the Italian network code. Currently, the methodology is applied within the Terna's resilience plan, which is the plan that gather all the investment planned by Terna to increase the resilience of the grid. And the main menaces that are assessed as those related to strong winds and the formation of wet snow sleeves around the wires of our overhead line, since are the major phenomena with a relevant impact in terms of outages for our asset. At the same time, we are trying to extend our methodologies to evaluate other phenomena with an impact to our asset, such as, for example, floods and landslide. Also evaluating techniques to better improve the predictions of the risk. In general, as also highlighted in the report, in Italy, much has been done in terms of embedding resilience into regulation and also into investment. For sure, as said before, much more could be done. In particular, for grid, I think for grid operators, it's important to further confirm, enhance, and extend the incentive schemes for infrastructural projects in order to ensure the increase of adaptation measures and the prioritization of these measures in grid operator investment plans. But I'm sure we'll have the occasion to further expand this theme, this topic in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. And I think we've now heard a number of perspectives from both regulators and the operators. May I come back to Monica, CERRE, with your reactions? And also, there was a question in the Q&A about whether you will consider also storage in the upcoming revision. So I would like you to...
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be short so that other people can also come in. The storage question is recurring, but I will get back to it. So a few of the reactions. On the one side, I think we have to differentiate between normal market functioning and when we are talking about low probability but high impact events. And the question is always to find where we are moving from one to the other. We always follow, we intend to follow the market first principle. So for as long as the market is willing to act, to be prepared, and to find solutions, that is fine. But there is a point where market is just not willing to do that. And we know that it is something that kind of risk that they cannot take up. So that's where I think the role of regulation comes in. And this is what we also consider as we revise our energy security framework. So this is one. Second, it has been brought up several times. Preparedness is a nice word today, but it wasn't a fancy word in the past. So there is a reluctance to invest in preparedness because it feels like it is money not very well spent. But we have to see, and we have to, I think, communicate much better what happens when we are not prepared, because the cost of not being prepared for an energy situation or a difficult situation, it can be much higher. And when it comes to preparedness, I think many examples were mentioned. Very robust risk assessments are important, taking and building on actually EU level assessments. For example, there is a EU climate risk assessment and risk scenario development going on. So that can be something which then individual member states and companies then can rely on. But also when it comes to critical infrastructure, the concept of resilience by design, so that any infrastructure that is planned and designed and built in the future already has that aspect built in. There are estimates that the cost can be increased by 3 to 5% if we have these kind of solutions built into projects, but of course that can change. And maybe the last point I wanted to make is about that was brought up as well. Let the individual market participants and member states do whatever their situations allow, is more about dynamic regulation. So the type of regulation that we are trying to push for is more identifying the objectives, a few principles, but then it will be up to the member states based on their particular situation, how they would need to, they can implement it. And this is where the storage question comes in. The storage regulation was very useful during the extreme crisis scenario, the crisis that we had 2 years ago. It may not be one of the measures that could be useful today, because there are many other tools that stakeholders, market participants, or member states can actually use. It can be increasing imports, it can be energy efficiency, it can be demand side measures. So we would like to see storage as one of these several tools that can help being prepared as well as handle a crisis situation. And I hope that I was short enough so that to allow other interventions. Thank you. You're muted.
Annika, you're muted.
Annika, we don't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oh dear, I'm really sorry. So I was thanking you for the tour d'horizon and for bringing up dynamic regulation as a concept that is really dear to our heart, because as challenges change, we have to adapt, become more adaptive and flexible with our regulatory frameworks. I'd like to pass the word to Chloé Lecoq, who's an economist at Paris Panthéon-Assas and also a co-author of the first paper we discussed today.
Yeah, thank you. Quickly, but I would like to thank all the speakers. It was a really interesting discussion, and I think there was a lot of ideas and effects. So of course, Monica and actually Jody mentioned this cascading effect, right? So you have multiple risks because we are connected, and this is something we need to take care of, and this is one of our conclusions. Maria mentioned this is also really important. Maybe we didn't really emphasize enough actually in our report, but this notion of data, what is transparency, which kind of data is reliable, if you think, but now Monica, you're saying, oh, we need to, have be prepared and so on, and how to be prepared, at which cost, then we need data, right? So to build up the scenario. And finally, I would like to mention one thing. So we've been discussing also, thanks to Monica with this exchange, because I want to mention this solidarity mechanism and also this idea that we are connected and we should be connected with this one single market. I think it's really important, but we all know that to some extent, and I like it when I think it was maybe Liz who said, okay, what is the acceptable level of resilience? This is this idea that maybe we do not want to be fully connected, right? Because maybe if we are fully connected, solidarity mechanism works like an insurance. So if you provide, a collective support during, a crisis, maybe indeed you might see the member state not really relying too much on assistance, maybe investing less. So that's also a risk that we like to call a moral hazard. It's well known when you provide an insurance. And I think this single market and this solidarity mechanism is really important, but maybe my say will be keep solidarity, right? Keep it strong, interconnection strong, but let's also make sure we have, we keep also the firm's incentives for risk prevention and for investment in resilience. So have it both, right? The market and the regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloé. Friedrich, 1 minute maybe for final reactions.
Yes, let me be very quick. First, thanks to all speakers. I learned a lot, and maybe I can just mention 3 things I'm taking away. First of all, this idea of resilience measures as insurance, actually preventing consumer losses instead of allowing them to happen and then paying for afterwards. Of course, actual insurance in the way we think about it is necessary too, at least in many cases, as a financial tool basically. But this is certainly an important issue. Oliver mentioned the 4th pillar basically resilience as a fourth pillar, and I took it as meaning that basically we need that fourth pillar to allow regulators to go forward and implement, and of course legislators first, but then regulators to implement the resilience in regulation. And finally, thanks for the lessons from Italy. I've read, and we wrote an earlier report on climate resilience, where we learned a lot from Italy, and Italy is, I think, a best practice case, and we can all learn a lot from it. I was especially interested in these steps that Clara delineated, and of course the methodology at Terna. So thanks.
Indeed, a great thank you to all our authors, to our panelists and our audience. And watch this space, as we will be continuing this discussion. Next on cyber risks, then we will turn to supply chain and recommendations for public procurement. We will also look at market risks, and then also the wider system consideration for energy security in Europe. So this discussion will continue. And if you're a regulator or an operator who wants to contribute, then please get in touch. We'll be happy to integrate you in the discussion. Thank you all very much, and have a great end of the afternoon.